Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining the first executive session hosted by Retail Next today with a focus on US retail trends, as well as in particular with the home furnishings category. It's my honor today to be joined by Andrew Neelon of OneRec as well, who will also be providing some very valuable insights regarding the data that we're about to go through today. But just a quick introduction, I'm Joe Shasteen, the Global Manager of Advanced Analytics at Retail Next. And just for those who might be unfamiliar, Retail Next is the pulse of the store, providing real-time analytical data that enable retailers to deliver a more responsive and consumer-centric experience at scale. We work with over 500 brands and retailers across the United States and globe, and have been a trusted thought leader on physical store trends for the last few decades. And with that, I'll be joined by Andrew Neelon of OneRec.
Thanks for inviting me here today. Always excited to be a part of Retail Next initiatives. And so I'm Andrew Neelon. I'm founder of OneRec, which is a platform of tools, templates, guides, resources to help brands get offline faster and on their own. I also am a development executive at Elase Med Spa, which is a national med spa chain.
And just a little bit of an overview of what today is. So today is supposed to be an extension of the annual Retail Next Executive Forum, which is an incubator for kind of deepened connections and conversations between retailers to really discuss both the current state of retail and the future state of retail. And Andrew, as well, has actually been a member or joined us at these executive sessions, actually been a host, a great host of, really leading some very thought-provoking panels at our executive forums as well. And, again, that's why we're really excited to have him here today to provide his insight into both the U.S. overall retail market as well as the home furnishings market within the United States.
Yeah, excited to be here again. And yeah, for those that haven't gone to any of these executive sessions, they're fantastic sources of just getting to meet really great people who are really in the know and learning a lot of really interesting observations and data points from both the Retail Next team and everybody else who's in attendance. And it's just generally a pretty good time. So I would highly recommend to anyone that has not yet made it out to one of them.
For today's agenda, we're going to go through kind of the latest traffic trends in the home furnishing stores. So primarily focused on the US. We'll also talk about overall US trends, and then we'll get into some specific kind of holiday 2024 performance predictions for what we expect to see from a traffic standpoint. And then we'll get into what I'm most excited about is the results of a new US consumer sentiment survey to really understand what are some of those drivers of conversion, drivers of non-conversion, what are the pain points that customers are often feeling in stores, and how can retailers best engage customers and get them to ultimately, make that purchase and feel a connection, a deeper connection with the brand that will ultimately get them back in the store, not just once, but multiple times, over the future. And then with a final point, we'll get into some best practices around how to best optimize stores for these market trends, for what we're seeing both in the overall landscape for traffic, but also in particular for individual stores with their own trends and their own labor allocation and their own, potential traffic and sales, KPIs and metrics that they are also looking to be comparing against and benchmarking against into the future. Going back to the beginning of 2020, right after kind of stores started to open up again after the COVID pandemics and some of the lockdowns. So what we really saw during that time period, as everybody saw, was very large declines at the beginning of 2020 when things started to open up. We then saw in 2021, trends started to reverse a little bit with large growth. And then we've seen a lot of stability over maybe the last year or two as we've started to get back into kind of the new normal with, trends being fairly flat year over year, but really over the last, 2020, mid 2023 up to kind of current date, where we're seeing, stability in that, slight decline from a traffic perspective with sales for the most part slightly under indexing what we've seen from a traffic perspective, really getting into the point around how conversion and getting shoppers to convert is becoming a bit more of a challenge as customers are becoming more discerning and maybe more, looking for the best deals or the best brands in order to make purchases at this time.
Yeah, and just to add a couple thoughts to that, would echo everything you've said. And I think what's really interesting, anytime I look at data, I like to also think about how does this correlate with other data points that I'm seeing or other anecdotes that I'm hearing. And I think two interesting things kind of immediately come to mind. The first of which is I think a lot of shoppers now are a lot more tech savvy, a lot more digital savvy, and a trend that we've always seen, and I think is becoming more amplified coming out of COVID with people getting more comfortable shopping online, is just the continued trend and behavior of browsing in store but buying online, and browsing online even more. And so I think it's really interesting to see that, the stable traffic trends, the stable sales trend is a little bit below zero here on average, post-COVID. And I think a lot of that also has to do with just the general where people are transacting. And so it's kind of in times like these that I always like to encourage people to not just look at the foot traffic data and the sales data on a four-wall basis, but also to consider what's happening online in those markets where you have stores, so that you're really getting to see the whole picture. And the other interesting observation is how this kind of seems a little bit counter to some of the more recent observations that real estate vacancies are at almost all-time lows at the moment. It's a really tight real estate market. It's hard to find good vacant spaces, despite the fact that we're seeing traffic come down steadily a little bit. But I believe that is more to do with the lack of new construction and new retail development, than anything else. But I think just another interesting observation that may seem a little bit counter to what we see here.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. And then wanted to just take a quick deep dive into the 2023 trends to really kind of focus on, what we're seeing, last year that's really going to inform what we're expecting over this holiday period for 2024. So to take a look at overall deep dive straight into 2023, what we were really seeing over that time period is that traffic was down about 1% year over year for 2023 compared to 2022. But we did see a larger decline in sales. So sales was down about 3% over that time period, really going back to that point around, that tougher market to maybe getting those consumers to make that purchase. We saw, despite traffic declining, we actually also saw conversion decline by about 1 percentage point as well, with, UPT going down a little bit, AUR, or average unit retail, up, kind of reflective too of the inflationary market, maybe making those customers a little bit more challenged, right, with their basket. They're not able to purchase quite as many units. They're having to purchase a little bit more expensive products, and that's ultimately driving down to a slightly smaller basket. But ultimately, what we ended up seeing when we got towards the holiday period, which is really, the most important portion of this, is that there's key dates in the holiday, right? So around the Black Friday week, that last week of November, that last week right before you get into Christmas, that's really when we started to see a little bit more of an uptick in traffic trends. So if we look maybe towards the top right of the slide that I'm sharing here, what we did see is that Black Friday in 2023 compared to Black Friday in 2022, despite overall market trends being slightly down, we did see that Black Friday was up about 2%. The whole weekend was up about 1.5%. And then when we get into the closer time periods around Christmas, we're seeing a huge increase in the Super Saturday volume for same date compared to maybe the Friday before. We were seeing about a 26% increase in traffic trends. So really seeing over that holiday time period, much more focus and growth on traffic as those shoppers really kind of use the events of holidays around Black Friday, Super Saturday, the day before Christmas Eve, to really do their last minute shopping. And that really drove consumers to go to stores and then ultimately, potentially make a purchase right before the holiday.
And the other really interesting, I always find holiday data so fascinating, because when you think about holidays and how they're tied to promotionality, and then you kind of take a step back and think about how a business is managed, and candidly, the politics in retail holidays and comp metrics, is something that I've observed is a lot of brands, if they want to comp a prior year's month, and they're finding that they can't get there without doing more promos. The obvious answer is, let's do more promos. And I think we've seen a lot of big box retailers extend the window of holiday shopping. And what I think that kind of unfortunately comes at the cost of is your everyday sales and your everyday comp rate. And so it's always interesting to see in a trend like this, where the everyday comp rate is kind of down, but certain holidays have big spikes. and I think is an interesting reflection of how people are managing to their KPIs and managing to really prioritizing growth over holiday periods as opposed to prioritizing growth over your everyday period. So the holiday trends are always just a really fascinating one to kind of take a peek under the hood and see what's really going on and driving that behavior.
And Andrew, not to put you on the spot with a question here, but kind of, what are your thoughts on maybe driving those sales more towards the holiday period versus, maybe giving up a little bit in the, kind of more, outside of the holiday period? Do you think that's an effective strategy? Do you think that, there's other things that retailers should consider when they're making those final decisions of, do you want to drive sales over the holiday outside of maybe your more kind of regular shopping periods?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of a double-edged sword. So I think when it's one of those things that you don't really notice until it's probably too late when you've seen the trend, as if, even it could look like a chart similar to this where you see and you can measure like what is your average daily sales on promo days, which tend to be holidays or right around then, versus your average daily sales on non-promo days. And what I've seen in the past pretty commonly is non-promo ADS, your average daily sales, starts getting soft, so everybody puts a lot more pressure on the holiday. So they either put more marketing dollars into those specific holiday days, or they elongate the amount of holiday or promo days exist in a month. And so as you kind of look at over time, like you can imagine a graph showing percentage of days that are promo versus your average daily sales on non-promo days. A lot of times it's a negative correlation because they're pulling sales into those promo periods. They're pulling demand into those periods, which are also lower margin generally. And you'll see over time that correlation begin to fill up a graph. And by the time you realize that the trend is there, you're like, oh no, what have I done? So I think it's important to prioritize both, and it just kind of comes down to, are you prioritizing short-term wins, or are you prioritizing a long-term healthy brand? And you don't have to be on one complete end of the spectrum or the other. There is a healthy middle, and that just depends on, every brand's particular circumstances, and perhaps more importantly, what their investors are expecting of them and what they've signed up for.
Great. Makes sense. Thank you. Great. So getting into kind of what we've seen as well over the course of 2024, and then we'll get into some predictions around what we might be able to expect around the holiday period. But, I think as through the year of 2024, we have continued to see those slightly declining trends, at least for the overall US market, right? So we're continuing to see sales slightly more negative than what we would expect just from a traffic. So traffic so far through 2024 year to date been down about 3.1% versus sales being down about 4%. Conversion at that rate has improved a little bit compared to what we saw from declines in 2023, but it still is slightly down by about 0.3 percentage points. Again, those sales declines and those larger sales declines continue to be driven a little bit more by the inflationary market. Even though inflation has improved over the course of 2024, we're still seeing that average unit retail up about 3% compared to the last year, and that UPT is down close to 2 points. So still seeing that basket declining, that increased unit, ultimately leading to a more expensive basket, but a smaller basket for our customers as well. And throughout maybe, the holiday period, we expect that to shift a little bit, but overall, we still would expect that, these trends are going to fairly hold, and that we would expect, maybe slight declines outside of the event holiday shopping periods, which we will get into in a few moments as well. So within the United States for 2023, across the various categories that Retail Next can report on, we have seen some general larger declines in the home furnishing categories, especially going back towards to the COVID time period, right? When home was typically one of our best performing categories, kind of all throughout 2020 into early 2021. We've seen since then, as a return to kind of a more of a new normal, the home category has in particular been seeing a little bit more of a degradation in traffic compared to, maybe some of the other categories that we've seen. So consistently over the course of 2023, we have seen that home furnishings category has been in that range of, about -8% year over year from a traffic standpoint. This is generally much lower than what we're seeing kind of in the other categories that we will look at. So, apparel and footwear are also slightly negative, but compared especially to the health and beauty and jewelry categories, which have been positive, home has definitely been seeing a situation where maybe there was, it's still a little bit recovering from the kind of increase that it saw during the COVID time period of, all the maybe front loading of purchasing and traffic into the home furnishing stores. We've really seen kind of declines kind of been consistent throughout 2023, and even as we'll get into in a few moments into 2024.
Yeah, and from my end, this was super interesting to see. I used to be in the home furnishing space, and so a lot of this really resonates with a lot of what I had seen at that time, and I've advised a number of home brands since then. And so what's really interesting and kind of as I see this data is immediately post-COVID, a lot of home and home furnishings purchases really accelerated. And you saw that with a ton of online brands that just exploded during and even a little bit after the pandemic. And throughout that time, a couple things were happening. There was a lot of debate around, are these purchases pull forwards or are they truly incremental? I think it's a little bit of both. And what I think this data is showing is that a pretty big chunk of it was pull forward as the 2023 year kind of stabilizes over the pull forward spend of 2022. And there's also, I think, a narrative around and a story around during the pandemic, a lot of home furniture brands, they weren't online. And so they lost a lot of business. They lost a lot of customers to other more omni-channel or digital brands, and they were unable to get them when the world kind of normalized again. And so over the last year or so, there's been a lot of consolidation within the sector, a number of bankruptcies and restructurings. And so there's just a lot of volatility that I think we really see come to light in this foot traffic data for that category, which is really interesting.
Yeah, and I think kind of focus a little bit more on the 2024 trends that we've seen, it's been actually very consistent. So I think 2023 was about 8.5. Through 2024, Jan to September, we've seen about 8% decline in the home traffic on top of that. So we're still seeing that decline, as Andrew mentioned, we're not, that pull forward still kind of leading to maybe an increased presence of some online brands really driving some more sales that, again, we're talking about physical home furnishing store traffic. So we're not taking into account any sort of online aspects here. That's really where we're seeing, those declines. And I think in comparison to the other brands, now in 2024, we have not quite seen as much positivity outside of the other, categories that we report on, right? Apparel, footwear, health, and beauty are all slightly negative, with jewelry basically flat year over year. So I guess from some positivity on that standpoint is home has seen an improvement, at least in its decline being less compared to what it was in 2023, while other categories have generally seen their declines actually increase. So, while still maybe not great for traffic to home furnishing stores, there has been a little bit more of a reduction in the declines that we've been seeing. And we hope that, over the course of the next year or two, we'll continue to see that reduction take place, hopefully getting back into closer to flat or hopefully even, positive at some point for some of the home furnishing retailers as well.
And one thing I'd also point out, particularly as it relates to 2024, is what will soon be a little bit of a different narrative, I think, in 2025, meaning that over the course of this year, I've advised a couple home brands and that are e-com digitally native. And what's really interesting is a lot of these formerly e-com only furniture brands are now very interested in stores because they're getting to the point of diminishing returns online only, and they're realizing they need physical retail, and people will still prefer to purchase furniture in physical retail. What the pandemic did was just kind of enable and train and condition people to now also do it online, but the preference is still in person, and a lot of these digitally native brands are beginning to really break into physical retail just across the board. And so I've heard rumblings of a number of different brands opening their first store this year. And I think going into next year, we'll see a continued trend that maybe will flip the script here a little bit. But I think it's important to call out that I think what's happening with the visitor traffic in home, as we see on this page, has a lot more to do with kind of the legacy players and less to do with what I think is going to happen in the near future.
Yeah. And just kind of an anecdotal story, and as a data person, it's kind of, I don't always like to say this, but from my own personal experience, when we were purchasing a home in 2021, when we were looking to outfit the home with couches and everything like that, we were looking online first to kind of get a sense as to, okay, we like this style, we like this brand. We'll look, kind of do our research online, but we weren't ever actually purchasing anything online. We would just do our research and then go into the physical store to actually sit on it. How does it feel and all that? So it really kind of goes back to that story of, at least initially using the online aspect to kind of do your research to really kind of understand what you're looking for, but still ultimately going into the store and making that, that purchase. And again, when I was doing that, was kind of in the sweet spot for home furnishings in that late 2020, early 2021 time period when we were seeing more growth in the home furnishings category. And kind of similar, as Andrew had mentioned, I haven't been purchasing too many couches over the last couple of years. So, as that pull forward, definitely took place, at least in my experience over the last couple of years as well. Then just to kind of showcase a little bit more around, regional traffic trends, we're not at this point seeing large differences on the aggregate level, at least in 2023, for when we were seeing, variations between the Midwest, Northeast, South, and West. All of those were down about 2 points to about 3 points year over year. Now, individual weeks will show larger variances, but for the most part, those trends have been fairly consistent regardless of regions. We will get into some more details around states and what we've seen, but I think the story is fairly consistent that in the aggregate we are seeing kind of the national trends are really also applying to individual regions within the United States as well.
Yeah, and I was just gonna say, when we were looking at this the first time, a few weeks ago, I was a little bit surprised to see some of the regional breakout. I would have thought, with all the headlines and news around and the data around people migrating to the South and to the Midwest, I would have expected to see those be kind of on the lower end of the spectrum of decline. So pretty fascinating to see that's not the case. But also, to your point, pretty consistent view that overall traffic is in a little bit of a slump.
Definitely. Yeah, and I think we've continued to see that trend kind of hold throughout 2024. Again, those declines are a little bit larger than what we saw in 2023, but outside of maybe various weak volatility due to some specific weather patterns, right? Especially maybe in the South where we're getting some more extreme weather. But in general, again, in the aggregate, the trends are fairly consistent kind of across regions. So again, 2024, Jan to September, seeing that trend about -3 across all the regions. And then when we get into some specific states, as Andrew had mentioned, we did provide a bit of a view, looking in particular at some of the key southern states that we've looked at, Florida, Georgia, Texas, where there's, more of those stories around more migration. And we've used, California and New York kind of as a control to look at, those states where you would expect to see maybe a little bit more migration, especially in, New York City around the COVID time period, all those stories about people moving, maybe not to, outside to, southern states or, Texas in that case, but moving more to the suburbs or maybe, some of the, surrounding northeastern states. But, what's been interesting from my perspective is that even though we've seen and maybe expected to maybe see declines in some of those states like California, New York, we've actually seen those states be some of the more strong states for actually returns to traffic, right? So those states in particular, California, New York, were actually hit the hardest by COVID during that time period, right? Down about 40 to 45%. But then they also saw the biggest returns after COVID. And then even since then, since 2022 March to date, those two states outside of Florida have really been driving a lot of the growth that we've seen. Now, Florida's also been a really big driver of growth at about plus 4.5% compared to, the same time period of the last few years. But really, what I guess was maybe a little bit more surprising is that we haven't quite seen that same growth in Georgia and Texas. We've really been seeing more flat to, maybe slight declines year over year in those states in particular, with really a lot of the growth being driven by, Florida, New York in particular, and to a lesser degree, California.
And I think another interesting thing here is, I think this really speaks to honestly just the strength of New York, and I say that as a New Yorker myself, strength of the market for retail. New York, it truly is the center of retail, not just in the country, but I would say arguably in the world. And the shopper is strong here, whether it's tourists or locals. People are still here spending money in stores, and they're here for that physical retail experience. So was both surprising, but also not surprising to see it showing such strong visitor traffic data.
So what we've done in this case is we've looked at the 2023 trends leading up to the holiday period, right? So if you just take on average your average holiday traffic, so we're considering November to December as our holiday time period. If we look at just the average holiday time period over that, and we just say that, your average traffic is 1 for that time period, what are we seeing, or what are our expectations for outside of that average day? What is the Black Friday going to look like? What is Super Saturday going to look like? And I think based on trends last year and based on trends from the previous 5 years as well, we really see a concentration of traffic around what we call kind of our event holiday shopping days. So Black Friday, Super Saturday, maybe 2 days before Christmas, that December 23rd, as people might be doing their final travel on Christmas Eve. We really see more of a focus and a driver of shoppers to stores on those particular days. So last year in 2023, we saw that Black Friday had about 3.1 times average traffic come into the store on Black Friday compared to the average day from November to December. Now, not quite as strong in the last week leading up to Christmas, but we're still seeing even Super Saturday at about 2.3 to 2.1 times average holiday traffic over that time period. And it's continued, and it's fairly consistent, right? Maybe not quite at the 2.3, 2.1, but as we get into that last week before Christmas, from that Super Saturday up to Christmas, is really when we're seeing, traffic trends at about 1.5 to 2x the average holiday traffic. So it really goes to show that our expectations are, while we might be expecting to see a slight decline in overall holiday traffic trends, we expect those big days, Black Friday, Super Saturday, we expect to see some increases as shoppers really tend to flock to stores on those kind of event shopping periods. And I think, from outside research, there's a recent report published by Bain for the holiday period where they expect Black Friday to Cyber Monday time period to have plus 5% increase in sales, up to $75 billion over that time period. So goes to show that while maybe the overall holiday period might be seeing some declines, those big days, those really big drivers, when there's, events, promos, really, those kind of discounts that you have to get out there for. And I think we will have some data to show this when we get in our consumer sentiment survey, is really getting customers, that call to action to get customers into the store and hopefully ultimately make that final purchase. Andrew, any thoughts you'd like to add regarding kind of predictions and kind of what you've been seeing in any conversations you've had with your retailers as well?
Yeah, I think this is pretty consistent with the previous data you had shown around, despite overall kind of non-holiday traffic being a little bit on a decline, holiday traffic being a little bit higher. I think from what I'm hearing and seeing, it's a little bit of a mix of things. It's what I mentioned earlier of just the politics of, okay, everyday traffic is slow. We got to really push people to get into the stores. But also hearing a lot of shoppers who are just a little bit more eager to do more in-store shopping, especially for the holidays. I think as everyday shopping becomes more and more digital, I think people still look to holidays for those in-store moments. And I know for myself especially, I prefer Christmas shopping in stores because there's an experience element to it. And so I think this also kind of highlights just the increasing importance of truly experiential retail around the holidays, because that's a much more differentiated experience than what you might be able to find online.
Recently, we conducted a US kind of consumer sentiment survey where we surveyed over 1,000 consumers within the US over the online platform sentiment to better understand kind of modern shopping preferences and ultimately what are those drivers or non-drivers of conversion. So those surveyed were based in the United States. They're between the ages of 18 and 64, and the survey was administered in late August, so between August 21st and August 23rd. So again, to kind of lay the groundwork, we asked these customers to understand how often are they shopping at physical retail stores and outside of maybe grocery, convenience stores, supermarkets, right? We want to understand how often are they shopping in maybe, more apparel-based, jewelry-based, right? Those kinds of stores. And, we're still seeing really strong responses, right? Customers are still getting into stores, at least, approximately 65% of people who we surveyed are shopping at least on a weekly basis. Very few, only 10 to 11% are kind of in the rarely or never category. So really, customers are still looking to get out to store, looking to get out and experience a brand. And really where we're seeing, more of that kind of growth in the daily shoppers is, those younger shoppers, right? So that group of, 18 to 34 group are really those shoppers who are more likely to shop on a daily or weekly basis compared to maybe those older shoppers, right, in the 45 to 64 category, where they're shopping a little bit less frequently, more in the maybe kind of monthly to rarely category. And I'm actually was a little bit surprised to see this too, is that males were more than twice as likely as females to shop at physical retail stores on a daily basis compared to women. So I thought, that was a little bit surprising from that standpoint. But I think as we'll get into in the next few slides is what this means ultimately from a conversion standpoint, and especially in getting those 18 to 34 or 44-year-old shoppers to actually make a purchase is actually getting to be more challenging than maybe it ever has been because they're more frequently in stores, they're more discerning, they're looking for a product, right, that they're particularly, interested in, and they're not just going to make a purchase just to make a purchase. But we'll be getting into that in a few slides as well.
Yeah, and I think what's also super fascinating about this is now this kind of two different attributes that may seem a little bit counter that will, I think, pose an interesting challenge for retailers in the future, which is younger folks tend to be more interested in shopping more frequently, but they're also a lot more digitally savvy and tech savvy and are tending to be a lot more multi-channel customer journeys before they purchase. And so on one hand, to appeal to what will be the largest age range as they get older and with more spending power, how do you get them to spend more time and money in the stores, knowing that they also will lean heavily into digital channels? I think will be a really interesting task for retailers ahead.
Yeah, and I think you touched on this a little bit, Andrew, but we also surveyed all these consumers around, how often are they leaving the store empty-handed, right? And overall, it's fairly rare, right? So about only 40% of time, 40% of customers are saying that they are rarely leaving the store empty-handed. 23% are saying it's often. But as we get into the demographics of those shoppers, we are seeing that younger shopper base, right, that 18 to 24 shopper base especially, was the most likely to often leave a store empty-handed. About 35% of those surveyed said that they will often leave a store empty-handed versus only 20% of those consumers saying rarely. And that's essentially flipped from when you get into the kind of older demographics where 47 to 50% of those consumers are saying they rarely leave, and then, they're often leaving empty-handed about, 20 to 15% of the time. So I think it almost is kind of, as Andrew was saying, kind of the converse of how often you shop is also how likely you are to leave empty-handed, right? If you're in a lot of stores, then it's going to be a lot more competitive to get you to make that purchase because you're browsing, you're looking for the deal. And we'll get into some of the reasons for why. But versus those shoppers who are in there less frequently, those are those shoppers who are much more likely to make a final purchase if we're able to meet the certain criteria that they need in order to make that ultimate conversion. Getting into some of the reasons for maybe why there's been, challenges or frustrations or ultimately leading to that lack of purchase. So initially this view is just, what are some of those frustrations? So long lines, crowds, out of stocks, those are really the kind of the three main drivers of leading to maybe frustrations with the purchasing product. Now, ultimately, this will not always mean that these are the ultimate reasons that they didn't make a purchase, but these are just those other factors that are going to lead to potential frustrations and lead to maybe more a greater likelihood of a consumer leaving the store without making a purchase. And I think ultimately in this case, while there are some minor differences between the demographics, I would say it's a little bit less of a stark contrast between, maybe younger or older demographics. They're all generally saying, outside of maybe lack of staff assistance, where we see a little bit more of a difference, but all generally, reporting at similar ratios of, long lines, crowded aisles, maybe out of stocks really driving some issues with frustration. But I thought what was maybe kind of the final interesting point was really around the lack of staff assistance. So in this case, 18 to 24 and 25 to 34-year-olds, only about a quarter of them were reporting a lack of staff assistance as really, being a frustrating factor for them. But there was that, 55 to 64 demographic that was reporting about 40% of these consumers were frustrated by lack of staff assistance. So, it really goes to show that it might make it more of a challenge in the retail environment, but it's not kind of a one size fits all model to kind of drive the conversion within different demographics, within different consumer preferences. Different consumers want to maybe be interacted with or kind of, discussed product with in a different way based on kind of how they shop and what their, experiences are or life experiences are as well.
Yeah, and I think what this another interesting observation from this is that it's, I think, a reflection of an unfortunate trend that is happening in retail broadly, which is tighter budgets, cutting staff. That tends to be the typical kind of sequence of events, which leads to longer lines because there's not as many people to help check out, which creates crowded aisles, which, limited inventory could also be a part of that, as well as the staff just isn't there as much to help put that inventory out or to scan it in. And so I think a lot of this is probably going to increase as retailers tend to take that typical kind of approach of, okay, softer traffic, softer sales, cut staff. And unfortunately, I think that becomes a bit of a downward spiral. Some of that, I think, to your point, as you mentioned on the lack of staff assistance, at least the stark contrast in the responses between 18 to 24 versus 55 to 64, I think is also potentially going to mitigate some of that downward spiral, as a lot of the younger age ranges specifically, as they kind of mature up and become a bigger part of the purchasing pool, they're a bit more comfortable saying, okay, I'm going to walk around, but I know I can just buy it online, so I'll just go do that when I get home. So I think it's a pretty interesting dynamic and pretty powerful to see, the top two or three, or even, you could even argue all of these are really a result of, or can be a result of the pretty common practice of cut staff, cut staff, cut staff.
Yeah. And then getting into maybe more, what is the actual driver of the reason why consumers are walking out empty-handed? It is a little bit different from what we've seen, right? So in this case, the limited inventory out of stock is really what was driving most of the reasons why consumers were walking on empty-handed, right? They're not trading product. They came in looking for product A, you don't have it, they're not going to purchase product B instead, right? They really are looking for what they want. And if it's not there, they're going to walk out and go to another store that might have it. We are seeing, difficulty finding items also a contributing factor, about that 40%. Might also kind of go a little, it's, maybe a different way of around lack of staff assistance, right? Maybe not clearly marked aisles, but maybe also they just don't want to go find a staff member to ask them where these items are for, right? They might just walk out. And then finally, to Andrew's point too, the higher prices than online. So having that more discerning customer who is going to be willing to shop online, is going to understand what prices look like in the online environment, they might be checking in the store to see what that price is going to look like. And if it's substantially different, they're willing to make that purchase, maybe wait a couple of days to get that order online. But, they're not going to be spending that extra money, especially with some of the tighter, the more constraints on wallets, again, in that kind of inflationary market that we've seen with that smaller basket and that higher AUR, really kind of driving the price sensitivity for a lot of these customers as well.
Yeah, and I also thought, agree with everything you said, and would also add that this, ironically, I think kind of supports something that I tend to recommend to a lot of new D2C brands who are opening stores for the first time, which is go with an inventory-less model, go showroom. And what I've found is, this obviously depends on the category and the general brand and service expectations, et cetera. But It's really hard, especially if you have an enormous amount of SKUs, to curate your first store perfectly with all of the things and to accurately forecast all of those SKUs perfectly. And it just becomes a really big pain to manage that inventory. And your staff is now managing the inventory, taking away from the customer experience, and can become a bit of a drag on working capital. And so, what I've found to be a much more simplistic approach, enable an endless aisle experience, and ironically eliminate some of this challenge of limited inventory and out of stock, is by having a showroom model where you can see, one of each different thing, but perhaps you can't buy it in the store itself. And I think as long as that experience and messaging is made very, very clear, and you've enabled a very strong tech experience, such as, being able to scan a product on your phone and add it to the cart so you can buy it when you go home, um, then I think that that helps to eliminate an enormous portion of these reasons why folks leave empty-handed. But again, requires a lot of preparation and training to do that.
And then just the final question that we had asked was, what are those factors that contribute most to maybe making an impulse purchase in a physical retail store? And I think, what we really see is that the biggest drivers are those kind of limited time offers or discounts, kind of maybe going back to that point around, the holiday, the event shopping time period, right? Especially Black Friday, they can often be heavily promotional, maybe around the Christmas time period too, really driving a lot of the need to make a purchase, as well as also too, to some degree, the eye-catching displays or packaging, right? How the product is displayed is really going to drive customers over to actually experience the product and then potentially make a purchase. We're not seeing quite as much, or at least self-reporting customers saying that, social influence or social media is really driving as many of those purchases. But at least from a demographic standpoint, we are seeing that those younger demographics are definitely more influenced by social media, by that kind of social influence, with almost a quarter of those customers saying, that is driving them to make impulse purchases. Whereas we get maybe, outside of that into the 45 plus category, those consumers are definitely less influenced by social media, social influence, and much more, focused on those limited time offers, those discounts, really looking for kind of those deals in many ways.
Yeah, and the one interesting observation I would add to this is limited time offers and discounts is the biggest factor that would contribute most to impulse purchases in physical retail, and physical retail customers tend to be less promotional and discount oriented. So it's interesting to see on one hand that discounts are what get them to impulse purchase, but even in the aggregate, the retail channel tends to have a higher margin because of fewer discounts, less promotionality actually needed to push the sales in that channel. So I think a pretty interesting pairing of what would seem like contradicting data, but kind of makes sense when you kind of peel the onion back.
With the final section, we just would want to kind of go through some best practices for how this data on both in-store traffic as well as interior traffic in dwells can best be used in kind of home furnishing environments to better optimize the store experience, make the store more efficient from a conversion and labor perspective as well. So the first best practice that we always like to discuss with our retailers is using this traffic to create better staffing models and allocate labor more effectively, more for traffic rather than transactions, which we often see as a lagging indicator of sales, and they can often lead to kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy of certain hours or certain times of days not leading to a high conversion rate. So one thing that we always like to tell our consumers to look at is look at their traffic rates, look at their labor allocation, as well as a ratio that we call shopper per labor hour, to make sure that that is within the range that retailers might be setting benchmarks to. Now, in many cases, there's no kind of gold standard benchmark. It's all more so regarding individual stores themselves and kind of what their overall trends look like, and ultimately trying to improve those individual store trends, comparing the store against itself. And that's typically how we like to talk to our consumers or our customers and make sure that they're really trying to be as efficient as they can for that individual location as much as possible.
And I would add for this category in particular, where there's a lot of shopping patterns and behaviors of going to a location, taking pictures, measurements of different products, whether it's a table and a table setting or a sofa or a desk or a lamp, and then going home, measuring it, make sure it all fits. This is definitely a category where it is even more important to staff to visitors rather than conversions, because what will happen, especially nowadays post-COVID, is people will go into the store, do all the things I just mentioned, but then want to go home and then pull the trigger at home. So just another even more important emphasis on staffing to labor than actual dollars and conversions.
Yeah, it's a great point. And then regarding using kind of more interior data, so using the data to identify opportunities with what we refer to as kind of our more top of the funnel metrics. So really making sure that valuable real estate within the store is being utilized as effectively as possible. So this is something that we like to look at as kind of our funnel metrics. So we look at how much space is being allocated to, in this case, various categories of product. And then ultimately, how is that space turning that space that it's being given into traffic from various customers? And then based on that traffic, how many of those customers are actually stopping and engaging with the product, dwelling there for a certain amount of time? In this case, maybe sitting on the couch, trying it out. And then ultimately, at the bottom of the funnel, what is that leading to from the percentage of units sold, right? So can really look at where are those variations of what are those areas that are really making the best use of the space that it's given, making the best use of the dwells that it has to make that conversion, and ultimately, what are those areas that are not, right? And then can we maybe reallocate some of that space to more efficient products or more efficient areas, or redesign how we're thinking about driving customers to these particular areas? But it can really just provide more details around the middle and the top of the funnel that oftentimes you might have details in an online or e-commerce style store, but in the physical store, you never really had insight into this until the data provided by Next in this case.
And the other thing I would add, in kind of an extension of the last slide too, is that in this category in particular, the value of the real estate is so much more than what you would find in most other categories. So for example, think about the amount of SKUs you can fit per square foot in a store at a West Elm versus a Gap. At brands and categories like West Elm, it's a lot fewer SKUs per square foot than you could get in apparel, which means that every SKU you place needs to be doing that much better than other sectors. So as you're thinking about, where should you be spending your time in merchandising, for example, this is an area that just carries a lot more weight for this sector specifically compared to other retailers.
Yeah, that's a great point around the kind of importance of really making use of the space as effectively as possible when there's less of it. True. And then just a final point around kind of reducing wait times. As we discussed during some of the consumer sentiment surveys, long lines, kind of crowds, not being able to find things is, not always a driver of non-conversion, but it's definitely a point of friction, right? That's leading to a less positive experience for consumers as they're in a retail space. So another really important metric that we can look at is, traffic into various areas, the staff allocation within these areas, and then just how many interactions are taking place across different zones or portions of the store, and can really be used to both guide our staff on where they can go to best interact with customers in order to, give them more knowledge about the product or help them address questions, things like that. Or can even be used to, just line busting or reducing wait times, right? When do you maybe need less staff out on the floor to address some of those questions, and they can actually be back behind a register and doing more, of that checkout activity to help reduce some of the friction points around wait times or other issues that consumers were mentioning that will lead to issues for them and ultimately might lead to a non-conversion point for them. With that, I'd like to thank you all for joining today. I'd like to thank Andrew as well for joining today, for providing his great insights. We do have the full data available for the U.S. Consumer Sentiment Survey. That is going to be available. You can access that through details that we'll provide at a later date. We will also be having another session in February, kind of as a recap of the holiday period, planning for the 2025. This session that we expect in February will be held live. It will include more of a roundtable discussion for guests and will also be closed doors. So please RSVP as soon as possible to secure your spot. And we would also be spending a special gift as well as a part of our executive session experience.